The last 3 weeks, we've been looking at the Gospel of Matthew. We've been looking at Matthew's Jesus, the Jesus that is presented to us through the Gospel author Matthew. And for us to wrap up this story, the story of stories this morning, I actually want us to go back. I want us to go to the very beginning of Matthew, because in my opinion, the beginning of Matthew, the first few verses of the Gospel of Matthew, on the one hand seem obscure and seem to have very little meaning for us, but actually tell us how powerful this story truly is, the story of Jesus coming down from heaven. So we'll be looking at Matthew chapter 1, what is known as the genealogy of Jesus Christ. And we won't look at every verse, but we'll look at Matthew chapter 1, select verses from the genealogy of Jesus Christ. It says in verse 1, the book of the genealogy of Jesus Christ, the son of David, the son of Abraham. Abraham was the father of Isaac, and Isaac the father of Jacob, and Jacob the father of Judah and his brothers. And Judah the father of Perez and Zerah by Tamar, and Perez the father of Hezron, and Hezron the father of Ram. Skip down to verse 5. And Salmon the father of Boaz by Rahab, and Boaz the father of Obed by Ruth, and Obed the father of Jesse, and Jesse the father of David the king. Verse 16. And Jacob the father of Joseph and the husband of Mary, of whom Jesus was born, who is called Christ. So all the generations from Abraham to David were 14 generations, and from David to the deportation to Babylon, 14 generations, and from the deportation to Babylon to Christ, 14 generations. The grass withers, the flower fades, but the word of God stands forever. Everyone has a story. Everyone in this room has a story. And while we focus this morning and through this season on the story of stories, Jesus Christ, as we wrap up this series and as we wrap up this service this morning, I want us to think briefly about our story. Whether we realize it or not, each one of us has a story, and for many of us in the room, you're very aware of your story. For the young in the room, you're filled with fear that one day your story won't be grand or won't be great. For the old in the room, you might lament because your story wasn't supposed to unfold the way it has. I never thought this would have happened to me. I never imagined this could have been the way my life unfolded. So young or old, rich or poor, we're all faced with either the fear of what our life would become, will become, or filled with lament and as we look back onto what our life has brought us. We all long for a great story, but can it be guaranteed? You see, the story of Christmas is the announcement for all of us, young or old, rich or poor. The story of Christmas tells us that because of Jesus and for all those found in Jesus, that you can have a great story. But your life, your story, has to be merged with Jesus' story. It's the only way we can guarantee an epic ending to our story. And what we have here in Matthew chapter 1 seems like random names and random facts and random ideas about the genealogy of Jesus Christ, places and persons, some people we've never heard of before. But this is Jesus' story. Make no mistake about it that Matthew is writing this in the first few verses of the first gospel of the New Testament to tell us that this one who was born 2,000 years ago has a story that's worth recognizing. The first thing that we see about the story of Jesus here in the genealogy account in Matthew chapter 1 is that this story, the story of Jesus being born, is historical fact. It's real. The reason that Matthew wants us to understand the genealogy is that this story of Jesus does not begin like this, in a galaxy far, far away. But instead, it says this Jesus was real. He was a real human being with real historic facts and real historical names. That the story of Jesus that we celebrate 2,000 years later is not a fable, it's not fiction, but it's real. The reason he wants us to understand and to read the real names and real facts and real figures and real places is because Matthew wants us to understand that this story is not fable, it's not fiction. See, most classic fables start with a story of a dragon, and then typically a prince or a king comes, and the rescuer comes, and then all of a sudden something happens and all hope is lost. But then, of course, the impossible happens and the curse is lifted and evil is defeated. We love these stories. We love it when the bad guy gets what is coming to him. But this is no fable. Doesn't start with a story of a dragon, doesn't start in a galaxy far, far away. Matthew wants us to understand that the story of Christmas is real, historical fact. It's something that you can believe. It's why he begins with this genealogy. It's Matthew's way of saying, you want to check it out for yourself? You want to check out this person, Jesus? You can read about him here, and you can read about the lineage of which he comes from. But not only is the Jesus story real and fact, but the genealogy, the story of Jesus, is shocking. You see, a genealogy, especially 2,000 years ago for the ancients, a genealogy was used to explain and to reveal your resume. You see, anybody that was born king of the Jews had to have a resume that fit the name, that fit the title, that fit the billing. And so genealogies were used to, in a way, flex the muscles of the one who was being presented as King of Kings and Lord of Lords. And often in genealogies, they were glossed up, you could say. And they wanted to emphasize, they would certainly emphasize people in a genealogy like Abraham. Wow, Abraham was part of your genealogy. Father Abraham, the great patriarch. You read a little later, David, the king of the Jews, the great king of the Jews, whose promised reign would last forever. That would be certainly an attempt to gloss up any genealogy or gloss up any resume. But what makes this genealogy or this resume of Jesus so shocking is not that it includes names like Abraham and David, but it includes women. In verse 3, we hear that Tamar is listed, and Rahab, and Ruth, and Bathsheba, and eventually Mary. You see, if you wanted to gloss up your genealogy, if you wanted to gloss up your resume, certainly 2,000 years ago, you would never include women in your genealogy. Women 2,000 years ago were not taken seriously. They had little rights. They had no land ownership. Their testimony would never be permitted in a court of law. So it's absolutely shocking that Matthew includes women in the genealogy of the one that is presented as King of Kings and Lord of Lords. But he goes a step further. Not only are women included, but he includes God-forsaken Gentiles. He includes racial outsiders. Ruth, who was Ruth? We're told in Deuteronomy chapter 23 that Ruth is a God-forsaken Moabite that would never been able, absolutely forbidden to enter the temple. We read of Rahab and the Canaanite prostitute. We read of all of these racial outsiders and Gentiles. But then he goes an extra step. Not only does he include women, not only does he include Gentiles, but he even includes the immoral. Tamar, who sells herself to Judah, and Rahab, and even Bathsheba. Bathsheba here isn't even listed by name. It just says her. Her. Matthew's way of emphasizing the immorality of what Bathsheba has done. So the genealogy of Jesus, the Jesus story for us should be absolutely shocking. Women are included, and racial outsiders are included, and even the immoral. And it's Matthew's way of saying that in Jesus' story, in God's family, all are welcomed. You see, the story of Christmas announces to all of us that those that were once considered outsiders are now included in the family of God. But we shouldn't be surprised, because isn't that the story of the Bible? It's the Samaritan woman being welcomed by Jesus. It's the Ninevites that God calls Jonah to preach to. It's the Ethiopian eunuch who finds favor with God. It's the man born blind and the prodigal son. And even the guy who's writing this gospel is a God-forsaken what? Tax collector. See, the story of Jesus is shocking. It means that we who are found in Jesus this morning, that regardless of where you've been, regardless of what you've done, you can have a new story. You can have a new identity. There should be a sense in which Christmas is shocking to us. And for all those here this morning that always felt like you were on the outside, the good news of Christmas is that God, even God, wants you to be included. See, the story of Jesus, the story that we've just heard and sung this morning, is real, and it's shocking. But most importantly, this story can be yours. And the reason it can be yours is because this story at Christmas has an incredible ending. The story of Jesus begins with Jesus being born. And that's what we celebrate at Christmas. But at Christmas, we also remember that it's the child that was born to eventually do what? To lay down his life for us. You see, the final chapter of Matthew, if you were fast forward to the very end of the Gospel of Matthew, we see a Jesus that lays down his life so that you can live. It starts with Christmas, but it ends with Easter. And because this story has an incredible ending, for all those that are found in Jesus, your life can have an incredible ending as well. Let me close with this. Janet leads in Illinois a Christian circle every week at the local nursing home. And there's an Alzheimer's patient by the name of Betsy who faithfully attends every week. And they end their circle weekly by singing a hymn. And this week in particular, it was Betsy's turn to read one of the hymns. She had lost many of her mental faculties, but the one thing that she had held on to was her ability to read. And the hymn that Betsy was chosen to read was The Old Rugged Cross. And Betsy began to read The Old Rugged Cross. And it sounded a little like this: on a hill far away stands an old rugged cross. And she went on to read the emblem of suffering and shame. But Betsy couldn't go on. Instead, she says, I can't do it. It's just far too sad. It's far too hard. The emblem of suffering and shame. And they say, Betsy, you can do it. And she begins again. On a hill far away stands an old rugged cross, the emblem of suffering and shame. I can't do it. I can't go on. It's just too sad. And Betsy tries again and again and again, and she can't get past the reality of the emblem of suffering and shame, the emblem of suffering and shame. And they say, Betsy, it's okay. It's clear that this is just too hard for you. And as Janet was walking Betsy back to her room, to her amazement, with tears falling down her face, she started to sing. On a hill far away stands an old rugged cross, the emblem of suffering and shame. And Janet expected her to stop, but instead, with more tears falling down her face, she went on. And I love that old cross where the dearest and best For a world of lost sinners was slain, so I'll cherish the old rugged cross, till my trophies at last I lay down. I'll cling to the old rugged cross and exchange it one day for a crown. You see, somewhere in that tattered mind of Betsy, she not only remembered the beginning of the story, the suffering and the shame, but in her old tattered mind, she was able to remember the end of the story, the cross, the old rugged cross. And for you this morning, your story might be marked with suffering and shame. But the good news of Christmas is that that doesn't have to be the end of your story. That you can sing along with Betsy, that although my life has once been marked with suffering and shame, because of Jesus, for all those that know Jesus this morning and trust in him and him alone, your story can end at the cross. There was a dragon, you know, but there was a prince. And he killed the dragon and he lifted the curse. And all those found in him will live happily ever after.